Chapter 29, The Black Hills. When we saw the first sign for the Black Hills, the whispers changed. No longer were they saying, "Slow, slow, slow." Once again they commanded, "Rush, hurry, rush." We had spent too long in South Dakota. There were only 2 days left and we still had a long way to go. "Maybe we should skip the Black Hills," I said. "What?" Graham said. "Skip the Black Hills? Skip Mount Rushmore? We can't do that." "But today's the 18th. It's the 5th day." "Do we have a deadline someone didn't tell me about?" Gramps asked. "Heck, we've got all the time in the—" Graham gave him a look. "I've just got to see these Black Hills," Gramps said. "We'll be quick about it, Chickabiddy." The whispers walloped me. Rush, rush, rush. I knew we wouldn't make it to Idaho in time. I thought about sneaking off while Graham and Gramps were looking at the Black Hills. Maybe I could hitch a ride with someone who drove extensively fast. But the thought of someone speeding, careening around curves, especially the snaking curves down in Lewiston, Idaho, which I had heard so much about, when I thought about that, it made me dizzy and sick. "Heck," Gramps said, "I ought to turn this wheel over to you, Chickabiddy. All this driving is making me crazy as a loon." He was only joking, but he knew I could drive. He had taught me to drive his old pickup truck when I was 11. He and I used to ride around on the dirt roads on their farm. I drove and he smoked his pipe and told stories. He said, "You're a hell of a driver, Chickabiddy, but don't you tell your mama I taught you. She'd thrash me half to death." I used to love to drive that old green pickup truck. I dreamed about turning 16 and getting my license. But then when Mama left, something happened to me. I became afraid of things I had never been afraid of before, and driving was one of these things. I didn't even like to ride in cars, let alone drive the truck. The Black Hills were not really black. Pines covered the hills, and maybe at dusk they looked black, but when we saw them at midday they were dark green. It was an eerie sight, all those rolling, dark hills. A cool wind blew down through the pines, and the trees swished secrets among them. My mother had always wanted to see the Black Hills. It was one of the sights she was most looking forward to on her trip. She knew all about the Sioux Indians and used to tell me about the Black Hills, which were sacred to them. It was their holy land, but white settlers took it as their own. The Sioux are still fighting for their land. I half expected a Sioux to come riding down on horseback and stop our car from entering, and the thing is, I would have been on his side. I would have said, "Take it, it's yours." It's mostly spoiled anyway. It's a shame. All along the road are billboards telling you not to miss the reptile farm, and not to miss the bear campground, and not to miss the buffalo park. We drove through the Black Hills to Mount Rushmore. At first we didn't think we were in the right place, but then jing bang, it was right before us. There, high up on the cliff face, were the 60-foot tall faces of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Teddy Roosevelt, carved right into the rock, staring somberly down on us. It was fine seeing the presidents. I've got nothing against the presidents, but you'd think the Sioux would be mighty sad to have those white faces carved onto their sacred hill. I bet my mother was as upset. I wondered why whoever carved them couldn't have put a couple of Native Americans up there too. Graham and Gramps seemed disappointed as well. Graham didn't even want to get out of the car, so we didn't stay long. Gramps said, "I've had enough of South Dakota. How about you, Chickabiddy? How about you, Gooseberry? Let's get a move on." By late afternoon, we were well into Wyoming, and I added up the miles left to go. "Maybe we could make it, just maybe." Then Gramps said, "I hope nobody minds if we stop at Yellowstone. It would be a sin to miss Yellowstone." Graham said, "Is that where Old Faithful is? Oh, I would love to see Old Faithful." She looked back at me. "We'll hurry." "Why, I bet we'll be in Idaho by the 20th without any problem at all." Graham said, "Is there some reason why we should be in Idaho by the 20th? Graham interrupted him with a most significant look. "Oh, he said. "By golly, that sounds about right to me." Chapter 30, The Tide Rises. "Did Peavy's mother call?" Graham said. "Did she come home? Did Peavy phone the police? Oh, I hope this isn't a sad story," she said. Phoebe did go to the police. It was on the day that Mr. Berkway read us the poem about the tide and the traveler, a poem that upset both me and Phoebe, and I think it is what convinced her, finally, that she had to tell the police about her mother. Mr. Berkway leaped through the doorway in his usual style, waving his arms and saying, "What a day! And isn't life glorious?" Phoebe leaned over to me and said, He's faking it. He doesn't want anyone to know he is a filthy murderer. Mr. Berkway read a poem by Mr. Longfellow. It was called The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls. Over and over in the poem is the line, the tide rises, the tide falls. And the way Mr. Berkway read this poem, you could actually hear the tide rising and falling, rising and falling. In the poem, a traveler is hurrying toward a town, and it is getting darker and darker, and the sea calls to the traveler. Then the waves with their soft white hands wash out the traveler's footprints. The next morning, the day returns, but never more. Return the traveler to the shore, and the tide rises, the tide falls. Mr. Berkway asked people for their reactions to this poem. Megan said that it sounded soft and gentle, and it almost made her go to sleep. Gentle, I said. It's not gentle, it's terrifying. My voice was shaking, but I couldn't stop it. There is this person walking along the beach, and the night is getting black, and the person keeps looking behind him to see if someone is following. And just when he is looking behind him, a huge wave comes up and pulls him into sea. A murder, Phoebe said. I went barreling on as if it was my poem, and I was an expert. The waves with their soft white hands grab the traveler. They drown him. They kill him. He's gone. Ben said, maybe he didn't drown. Maybe he just died like normal people die. Phoebe said, he drowned. I said, it isn't normal to die. It isn't normal. It's terrible. Megan said, what about heaven? What about God? Mary Lou said, God? Is he in this poem? Ben said, maybe dying could be normal and terrible. When the bell rang, I raced out of the room. Phoebe grabbed me. Come on, she said. From her locker, she took the evidence which she had brought from home, and we both ran the 6 blocks to the police station. I am not exactly sure why I went along with Phoebe. Maybe it was because of that poem about the traveler, or maybe it was because I had begun to believe in the lunatic, or maybe it was because Phoebe was taking some action, and I admired her for it. I wished I had taken some action when my mother left. I was not sure what I could have done, but I wished I had done something. Phoebe and I stood for 5 minutes outside the police station trying to make our hearts slow down, and then we went inside and stood at the counter. On the other side of it, a thin man with thumpingly large ears was writing in a black book. Excuse me, Phoebe said. I'll be right with you, he said. This is absolutely urgent. I need to speak to someone about a murder, Phoebe said. He looked up quickly. A murder? Yes, Phoebe said, or possibly a kidnapping. But the kidnapping might turn into a murder. Is this a joke? No, it's not a joke, Phoebe said. Just a minute. He went up to a plump woman dressed in a dark blue uniform. He whispered to her, and she turned to look at us. She came to the counter and leaned over it. She wore big round glasses with thick lenses. Is there something I can help you with? She asked. When Phoebe explained, the woman smiled. Is this something you girls have read about in a book, perhaps? No, it is not, I said. That was the turning point, I think, when I came to Phoebe's defense. I didn't like the way the woman was looking at us, as if we were two fools. I wanted the woman to understand why Phoebe was so upset. I wanted her to believe Phoebe. May I ask who it is who has been kidnapped or possibly murdered? The woman said. Phoebe said, my mother. Oh, your mother. Come along then. Her voice was rather too sugary and sweet, as if she was speaking to tiny children who had asked to go to the toilet. We followed her to a little room with glass partitions. An enormous man with a huge head and neck and massive shoulders sat behind the desk. His hair was bright red and his face was covered in freckles. He did not smile when we entered. After the woman repeated what we had told her, he stared at us for a long time. He said his name was Sergeant Bickle, and Phoebe told him her name. Then she told him everything. She explained how her mother's disappearing, and about the note from Mrs. Cadaver, and then about Mrs. Cadaver's missing husband, and the rhododendron bush, and finally about the lunatic and the mysterious messages. At this point, Sergeant Bickle said, what sort of messages? Phoebe was prepared. She pulled them out of her book bag and laid them on the desk in order in which they had arrived. He read each one aloud. Don't judge a man until you've walked 2 moons in his moccasins. Everyone has his own agenda. In the course of a lifetime, what does it matter? You can't keep the birds of sadness from flying over your head, but you can keep them from nesting in your hair. Sergeant Bickle looked up at the woman seated next to us, and the corners of his mouth twitched slightly. To Phoebe, he said, "How do you think these are related to your mother's disappearance?" "I don't know," she said. "That's what I want you to find out." Sergeant Bickle asked Phoebe to spell Mrs. Cadaver's name. "It means corpse," Phoebe said. "Dead body." "I know. Is there anything else you would like to show me?" Phoebe pulled out the envelope with the unidentifiable hair strands. "Perhaps you could have these analyzed," she suggested. Sergeant Bickle looked at the woman, and again the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. The woman removed her glasses and wiped the lenses. They were not taking us seriously, and I felt my ornery donkey self waking up. I mentioned the potential blood spots that Phoebe had marked with adhesive tape. "But my father removed the tape," Phoebe said. Sergeant Bickle said, "Well, thank you very much, Miss Winterbottom and Miss Hiddle," I said. "Salamanca Hiddle." "Miss Winterbottom and Miss Hiddle, I wonder if you would excuse me a few minutes. Would you mind waiting here?" To the woman he said, "Why don't you stay with these young ladies?" So we sat there with the woman. She asked Phoebe about school and about her father and her mother and her sister. She had an awful lot of questions. I kept wondering where Sergeant Bickle had gone and when he was coming back. He was gone for over an hour. There were 3 framed pictures on Sergeant Bickle's desk, and I tried to lean forward to see them, but I couldn't. I was afraid the woman would think I was nosy. Phoebe asked the woman if she might try on her glasses. The woman handed them to Phoebe. "Goodness," Phoebe said, "the world must look very different to you than it does to me." "Yes," she said, "I suppose it does." "I am certainly glad that I can see normally," Phoebe said. Sergeant Bickle finally returned. Behind him was Phoebe's father. Phoebe looked extensively relieved, but I knew it was not a coincidence that her father had come to the police while we were there as well. "Miss Winterbottom," Sergeant Bickle said, "your father is going to take you and Miss Hiddle home now." "But," Phoebe said, "Mr. Winterbottom will be in touch. And remember, if you would like me to speak with Miss Cadaver—" "Oh, no," Mr. Winterbottom said. He looked embarrassed. "Really, that won't be necessary. I do apologize." We followed Mr. Winterbottom outside. In the car, he said nothing. I thought he might drop me off at my house, but he did not. When we got to their house, the only thing he said was, "Phoebe, I'm going to go talk with Mrs. Cadaver. You and Sal wait here." When he returned from visiting Mrs. Cadaver, he said that she was unable to give him any more information about Phoebe's mother's call. All Mrs. Winterbottom had said was, "Tell George I am fine and that I will phone him soon. Tell him I would phone him now if I could, but I can't." "That's all?" Phoebe asked. "Your mother also asked Mrs. Cadaver how you and Prudence were." Mrs. Cadaver told her that as far as she knew, you and Prudence were fine. "Well, I am not fine," Phoebe said. "And what does Mrs. Cadaver know anyway? And besides, Mrs. Cadaver is making the whole thing up. You should let the police talk to her. You should ask her about the rhododendron bush. You should find out who this lunatic is. Mrs. Cadaver probably hired him. You should—" "Phoebe, your imagination is running away with you." "It is not. Phoebe, Mom loves me," she said, "and she would not leave me without any explanation." Then her father began to cry.